Welcome to this talk on learning outcomes. Learning outcomes are the building blocks of effective curriculum design, and they help to provide the clarity of expectation to students and other stakeholders involved in the learning, teaching and assessment process. And in this really short presentation, we're going to talk about how you construct learning outcomes and what reference points you use to frame them. Start at the end. So I thought it'd be useful to think about what a final learning outcome actually looks like before we talk a little bit about how you construct them. So my reference point here is this resource, which is produced by the Higher Education Academy as was, which says that a learning outcome has three principal components to it. The first one is an active verb or a phrase. The second one is an object of that verb. And the third one is a clause or a phrase that gives some kind of context or condition to the things that you've previously described. There's two examples on the slide. For example, evaluate, the active verb, the relationship, the object, and the context between the company directors and shareholders. And if you're familiar with learning outcomes, I'm fairly confident you will see these three elements in most of them. Top tips. So when constructing your learning outcome, using the guideline on the previous slide, how should you go about it? Well, the Higher Education Academy give these 4 points of guidance. The first one is that they should be written in the future tense, what the student will do or will achieve. The second one is that you need to identify from all of the module content what are the absolutely important learning requirements from that module. And these are the things that should form the context within your learning outcome. The things that you identify should be both achievable, something you feel that students will be able to achieve through the course of a module, and most importantly, perhaps accessible. So if you're asking students to demonstrate something or evaluate something, think about how can I assess whether they have done that or not. We will see later on that each of the learning outcomes is mapped to the assessments on the module. So we need to be reassured that we can assess in some way each of the learning outcomes. The final tip is perhaps obvious but worth restating, is about the learning outcomes being clear. These are student-facing documents, so this is not time to use technical or subject language unless absolutely necessary. Use language so it's absolutely clear to the students what they are trying to achieve. Verbs. One challenge for some when creating learning outcomes is knowing what verb to use when constructing your learning outcome. One tool that may be useful is Bloom's Taxonomy, which you may be familiar with. Though it's not without its critics in the sector, its model does give you a useful framework for understanding how students learn through the various levels, beginning with remembering and understanding, and ultimately achieving evaluating and creating. And you can see on the slide here the use of the kind of words that demonstrate these various levels of Bloom's taxonomy illustrated in bold. There are also a number of resources, one of which is highlighted on the table here, which show you the kind of verbs that commonly appear in learning outcomes. The question is understanding what the learning outcome is trying to demonstrate, then choosing the appropriate verbiage aligned to Bloom's taxonomy and the level of the module. Framing. So back to the beginning in a way, it's important when writing module learning outcomes to understand all of the elements that you can see on the slide here. So a module is part of a program or programs. and that program will have an aim, which is an overarching statement that describes the purpose and the general experience of the program. It generally is focused on what the program hopes to achieve. And these are often written in the terms of the intention of the program rather than specific description of what the students' learning will look like. Then you have program learning outcomes. And these are broad expectations of what the student will achieve at each level or against specific skill types. And these are really important to understand because they will frame what the various module learning outcomes aim to deliver based on the stage of study. Then finally, you have your module learning outcomes, which set out what the student should know or be able to do on successfully completing a module. There are several other important reference points to consider when producing learning outcomes. The first one is the framework for higher education qualifications. The second are the subject benchmark statements, the QA guidance, and both of these provide useful context of what should be required in a particular discipline's module learning outcomes. Of course, if you have a PSRB, a Professional Society or Regulatory Body, they may also include some information that is important in learning outcome construction. The last link is to the University of Derby's Academic Regulations Part B, which includes a description of levels 4, 5, 6 and 7 and some of the general kind of principles and themes that should be explored at those levels. Also a useful reference point.